All right, let's get back to my original question. Where did the leaked questions come from, and who benefits most from their release? Here with me now, former criminal defense attorney and legal analyst Emily Compagno, and townhall.com editor and Fox News contributor Katie Pavlich. Emily, I will start with you. What speaks to you first and loudest when you read these questions?
That the questions really focus on the president's intent behind his actions, right? They're kind of these open-ended questions where they're not factually based. So I think that goes toward the reporter just now talking about that a lot of these are focused on obstruction of justice, because with that charge, it matters not whether the justice was actually obstructed, but the intent behind it. And note that it doesn't require the president or anyone's blatant, commitment to that. Documents or other notes can provide evidence toward that. So if he gets to talking, as we know he does, then he can talk himself into a corner, and that's what Mueller is probing here. And secondly, the fact that up until now, we haven't heard reports of Manafort reaching out to Russia, right, with attempts for requests for assistance for the campaign. There's a particular question that discusses that, and so that here is novel, and that's important for viewers to follow as well.
All right, and what do we know about the authenticity of the questions? Has anyone from Mueller's side denied that these are the actual questions?
I've heard no denials, and I will note, too, that the only one that I see benefiting from these questions, frankly, is Mueller himself and the investigation team, and here's why. Because now that they're out, it almost backs the president or anyone into a corner that these questions are out there for them to answer. Now, we know that Rudy Giuliani is negotiating with that investigation team right now, and the president might actually sit down against the stark recommendations of a lot of attorneys and legal analysts out there, but it kind of puts those tenets out there, and perhaps it bodes well to leverage as well, right? Because as the investigation is closing in and the things that they're using for leverage, the fact that these questions are there, that's what they can use as a tool as well.
All right. So, Katie, let's talk about some of the political ramifications here. It's very interesting that these questions came out and they don't seem to be that damaging to the president. And a lot of them seem to get to the president's thoughts and feelings, which are sort of divergent from the initial intent of the investigation in the first place, which was to find some connection between Russia and the Trump campaign.
Well, one big theme that I noticed going through all of these questions, and there are many of them, and none of them are yes or no questions, we might add, is that they're asking specifically about things that President Trump did during the transition period or as president. So questions about why he decided to fire James Comey, questions about the recusal of Attorney General Jeff Sessions with the Russia investigation, why he made certain personnel decisions when it came to Michael Flynn. So that puts it on the special counsel in the sense of, why are you asking questions about the president simply exercising his authority in firing people who are in the executive branch, which he oversees and is in charge of? I mean, as we've talked about, Hillary Clinton also would have fired James Comey. I wonder if she would be asked the same questions if she were under the same kinds of investigations. But the thing that also stood out to me is a few of these questions, we have to keep in mind that prosecutors ask questions that oftentimes they know the answers to. And when they're asking about General Flynn's answers to questions, when they're asking about what Paul Manafort did or did not say or do, they might actually know those questions. And let's not forget, they've both Manafort is still fighting his trial or his case out in court.
Yes.
But Mike Flynn has pled guilty, and there were all these questions about whether he would flip and give the FBI information. So if he's already said something that Mueller has, they're going to try and match up the answer should the president give it, which I don't think he will at this point, and see where the truth lies in those answers.
And it's interesting because Rudy Giuliani has said that, under any other circumstances with an ordinary citizen, you wouldn't subject them to this kind of questioning. But the president is not an ordinary citizen. Obviously, he's trying to narrow the parameters because there is a lot of broad stuff here.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of open-ended questions that are essentially, what did you mean? How did you feel? And I don't know that if the president answers honestly, and even if he answers in a way that Robert Mueller finds unbecoming, that any of that is illegal.
Right. Well, people have argued that this is about obstruction of justice, right? But how you felt about a certain situation isn't a factual grounds for a prosecution in an obstruction of justice case by any measure of what I've heard the legal experts say about this. So moving forward, they're going to have to decide if the president is going to answer these questions. There's been a lot of battles on the president's private legal team about what steps they should take moving forward. And when the White House is asked specifically about these things, and specifically today about the questions that were allegedly leaked. We aren't sure where they came from, but I think they probably came from the president's private legal team to get the politics out on this. They're going to have to decide whether it's politically expedient to answer them or not, or whether it's more of a problem legally for the president to sit down and answer these questions.
All right. So, Emily, one last question to you. Is there legal recourse for Robert Mueller when this investigation is complete? Could he be questioned by Congress about the ways that he put the investigation team together and the relationship that he had, particularly with James Comey?
Absolutely, he can. And note, too, that this entire investigation has raised kind of the friction between Congress and this investigation in terms of that transparency. So certainly when it's over, he can be called and should be called to answer about what went on behind the scenes and how he made his decisions and why. I'd also like to point out really quickly for viewers as well that the ramifications could be larger than just charges that are myopically focused within those questions, right? That this can form the basis, as some Democrats are crying for articles of impeachment against the president and for other things. So I agree that while intent is the crux of obstruction of justice, it's not just the charges that relay straight from this that could have an effect on the president moving forward. So watch for that as well.
And there are other legal analysts who say that this whole thing could be one big perjury trap. We'll see how it all plays out. I think we should let the investigation continue, but I do think that Robert Mueller does have some splaining to do when it's all done. Emily and Katie, thank you both so much.
Thanks.